Hey, welcome everyone to the Compliance Corner. I'm Milan, and today we're going to be talking about CISOs being criminally charged per the SEC. So today I'm going to be talking with Lee, who we'll bring on in a moment. But again, if you really find the content liking, please hit the subscribe and the like button, and you'll get notified of future topics. So let me bring on Lee here. Hey, Lee, good to see you.
Hey, likewise.
So again, I thought your blog, which again is linked down below, was a great discussion topic as we think about talking about, what does it mean now for signatories to actually sign paperwork for the company? Because I think it brings on a very interesting dynamic on what it means for CISOs or compliance people, because I also am in a position where we have to sign certain paperwork. So today we'll talk about some of the potential implications, maybe the SEC filing as well, what it means to be charged with fraud, because I used to work for the FBI where I did a lot of these cases. And then we can talk about some potential impacts of what's happening in the future. And as always, the disclaimers that these are our personal thoughts and don't necessarily reflect the views of our company that we work for. So Lee, why don't you give us a brief overview of the blog that you wrote?
Sure. Yeah. So the blog that I wrote was really, trying to summarize my thoughts and opinions that I think a lot of the CISO community is feeling. Where the SEC, just to recap, right, came out about 2 weeks ago, right, and they formally charged SolarWinds and their CISO Tim Brown, right, with fraud, right, against investors. And so this is the second case, right, in 2 years. In 1 year, in the past year, where a CISO has been charged. The first one being, right, the Uber CISO, and that one has a little bit of a different flavor to it, and we could talk about that if we want. But really, I think this one, with the SEC charging SolarWinds and Tim, is causing some ripple effects within the community, because now it's like, yeah, I mean, just like with with compliance, right? When you're attesting to something, in this case, right, with SolarWinds, when you're attesting to the state of your security program, those filings, right, go into your SEC filings for the state of the company. And in this case, what the SEC is arguing is they're arguing that the company was stating or overstating the security, right, of their company, when internally they were having much different conversations. I think we can all probably say that we've had some internal conversations where the external reality differs, right, from the internal reality, and I think that's to your point, where is the line here, right? Because you do need to be able to discuss these things internally with your team, with your executive staff, with the business owners that own these things, right? And if you're going to have that used as evidence against you, in that you knew, right, that things were not as good as they were necessarily referenced externally, I think that's a difficult position to be in, because how else are you supposed to have those discussions in internal communications? So so here from a signatory standpoint, right, from a CISO perspective, right, you're effectively signing off and attesting to the maturity of your program, right? So let's just think about hot topic, right, vulnerability management, right? If you go out there, right, and say in your filings or whatever representation you're making that you don't have any critical vulnerabilities in your products, or you've resolved all of the ones that you're supposed to resolve as per whatever guidelines you have, right? That's you putting your name and your reputation on the line that your company has met the bar for whatever you're doing. And same with compliance, right? If you attest to a compliance regulation like PCI or FedRAMP or HIPAA or whatever, you're attesting that your program has met that state. And I think that's the difficult part of it, as you know, right, which we'll talk about in a bit, is that the CISOs or the security executive or the compliance people are not necessarily, or very rarely, right, the business owner for the thing that you're attesting to, right? And so there's this kind of trust but verify aspect where you're reliant on the business owner to give you accurate information. And in this case, right, you could see where it could become difficult, where the business owner says, oh yeah, we patched that thing. And then you make your filing, right? And it turns out that filing is inaccurate because the business owner told you inaccurate information. And now the CISO is going to be held accountable for that. And I think that's the difficulty with this recent filing from the SEC.
Yeah, I think that scenario, which I want to separate out the two scenarios here. So the one scenario you just talked about was, okay, the CISO was not informed of something that did or did not happen with the system, right? Like, for example, there are things called bridge letters that compliance people have to sign. They say there's been no substantive changes to certain things like change management. Otherwise, you have to notify that, right? That's a requirement. What exactly is a substantive change? And if you weren't notified, well, I don't know if ignorance is an excuse. So I think that's a challenging one from a legal perspective. If you're attesting to it, just because you didn't know, well, you probably need to put in other controls so you can know, or at least understand where the information is coming from. But I'm actually concerned. Well, I'm not concerned, but I'm curious of your thoughts on what are the ones where a CISO or a compliance person makes a recommendation to a business owner who chooses not to fund that action, right? Again, if there's gray area, the business owner makes the decision both from a resourcing and implementation. So that's a case where I'm curious in your thoughts of what if you have this disconnect in expectations. See, as a CISO might say, well, you really need to go do this security patch or put in the security feature. And then the business owner says, can't afford it. The risk is acceptable. That's the one I'm curious on your thoughts, and how do you think about that scenario?
Yeah, I think that's taken on a little bit of a new perspective here, right? With these SEC filings, right? And so, what I would recommend in that situation, where first, let me just say that as a security professional, I don't expect, right, that all of my recommendations will be followed, right? Because if we did, right, ultimately the most secure way to operate a business would be like unplug from the internet, and that's not a reality, right? You can't conduct a business that has risk and not incur that risk, right? So I think, our jobs, right, as security professionals are to make a recommendation, say, look, this is what I recommend. This is how I would manage that risk or mitigate that risk or whatever it is. And, that may come with a business cost or whatever it is. And it's up to the business owner to say, okay, great, I'm going to fund that and do it. Or no, I disagree. I want to accept that risk and we'll continue with, doing our normal business, but we won't address that problem. I think those are perfectly reasonable outcomes. I think where it gets difficult in this case is that if it is that situation you described, where, the security professional has made a recommendation that says, okay, you should fix this thing before we go into production or whatever it is. And the business owner says, no, I'm not going to fix it. Right. Where it gets challenging is if you're the one signing off, right, on that thing being able to go live in production, you're giving the attestation or the impression that that thing is, right, secure or has met some sort of bar for security, compliance, whatever, in running in that state. And so my recommendation would be, if that is the situation and you're going to be the one signing off on that, you might want to treat it as an exception, right? Document it as your formal exception process and say, okay, you've ignored my advice, right? You're choosing to conduct business without fixing this thing. we're going to document that as an exception, and you're going to accept that risk, and we're going to document that. If that process doesn't exist at your company, what I would recommend is, you try to get these things in writing where, a simple email, hey, we've discussed this. This is my recommendation. You've decided to do this. Does that match your expectations, right? And at least, if you fall back to, you're showing up in front of the SEC or Congress or, your DOJ investigator, right? And they're asking you, well, did you know about this thing? You can be like, yes, I did. You can see this is the email I sent on that date with the recommendation. That person responded and said that they, acknowledged my recommendation, but didn't want to do it. So that's on them, right? And that's kind of where you're trying to, I wouldn't say pass the risk, but you're at least trying to acknowledge the fact that you recommended something different and that person chose to do something different. And that may be a perfectly fine business outcome. Where you don't want to get into, right, is exactly, what I think this SEC charges are implying is that, like, let's say that you made that recommendation, or you knew that the thing was bad and you let them go into production anyway. Right. And then there was no formal documentation of that decision saying, yes, we all acknowledge that this thing is bad. We're going to fix it in 90 days or whatever it is. It's just saying, like, we knew it was bad, but we're not going to tell anybody. And there's no sort of formal decision-making process as that part of it. I think that's where you'll run into challenges, because now it's, like you said, you are the signatory. You are attesting that your company or your business is doing things the way they should be done. And if you're not documenting the deviances, the deviation from that, I think that's going to come back on you, right? For why did you let that thing happen when you knew it was a risk?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also agree that, in every business, you are going to make decisions. And I think, like, what we're identifying is that SEC rule or SEC lawsuit, actually, the charges actually, I think, change some of the dynamics of what it means, for who actually is accountable for the decision, right? Because as we talked about, CISOs or compliance experts usually are not the decision maker in the end, right? We make recommendations, like you say, and the business owner makes the determination of, can they afford it? Does it make sense? Is it acceptable risk? So really, do you wonder if it changes the dynamic of who becomes the actual signatory for a lot of this document, or a lot of this paperwork? Because in the end, if you don't agree to the paperwork, well, you could sign it or not sign it, but you're not the actual decision maker in the end. So do you think this maybe changes the dynamic of signatories moving forward?
It's possible. I mean, whether or not the business owner is the final sign off or not, I'm not sure that it's certainly one possible outcome. Although, you might get into the situation of, like, the fox watching the henhouse thing, where, like, the business owner just kind of, like, stamps, right, everything. Oh yeah, we're not going to do that. We can't afford it. So we're just going to stamp it off. And then it's like the CISO is just going to get overrun. I think, the CISO or the compliance function is there, right, to act as that speed bump, that check and balance, and be like, what are we doing? Okay, I don't recommend that. Right. So I don't know that, I mean, it would probably make sense, right, for the business owner to be the final signator, final signee, if there is a risk, right, that you disagree on, and okay, well, you're signing off on this; it's a business risk. But I think in most cases, right, the security executive probably is somewhere in that chain. And as long as there's a formalized business process to capture that, I think it's okay if the CISO or the compliance officer, for example, is the final signee, as long as that business person is somewhere in the chain, right? What you want to avoid, right, is that business person coming to you and kind of, like, floating those gray areas where it's like, hey, we're not really great on this, but we sort of think we can interpret it this way. Would you be comfortable signing off on this? And you're kind of like, not so much, right? And that's where you will want to have some sort of formalized decision process, regardless of who's the end all be all, of signing that off. And I also do think, you and I have talked about this offline, but I do think it depends on where the CISO function sits, right? Yeah. I think if it sits within, like, the product or maybe the engineering org, maybe then it does make sense, right, for that kind of senior person in those organizations. Maybe it's a CTO, maybe it's a CIO, maybe it's a chief product officer, to sign off on that, right, saying that they acknowledge the risk and we're going to move forward anyway. If you sit more in, like, a corporate function where you report to the CEO, right, or maybe the CFO, right, or the chief legal counsel, maybe then it makes sense for you to be that sign off, because you're representing that sort of separate org to do that. So, I can see both sides of it. I think it just depends on where the function sits, and really, look, at the end of the day, have a robust process that documents these things so you can fall back on it, and kind of, walk through the formalized decision making process to be able to point back if these things end up in court, which they might, right?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I read through the SEC press release. As a former FBI agent that did a lot of fraud cases very similar to this, it really comes back to the paperwork, right? Like who was accountable and who signed the paperwork, because that's where it all starts. And we can say, well, it coulda, woulda, shoulda after the fact, but I can tell you investigations don't work that way. So I think the interesting thing by bringing out criminal charges is really, what is that responsibility when you don't necessarily agree, and say the business doesn't agree, and then the business is the decision maker. I can tell you that I think that, in my experience working with a number of senior engineering teams, not in my current role, but just previously, that when they realize that they are when anybody, it's human nature, realizes they are liable for something, like personally, they tend to focus
Yep.
on it a little harder. And I think, like you say, some of it really depends on how you're organized. Because again, if you're in a team where the fox is guarding the hen house, it might give a different view of that. But all the senior people I've ever worked with know, like, if they're accountable, they always ask the deep, hard questions, right? Because again, it's that level of responsibility, which I really think is what's shown here from what I've read, which again, I don't know, we don't have all the paperwork yet, but from what I saw, the things that they referenced and went after are things that likely put you in that area of decision making and risk taking and signatory. So I guess it's going to be interesting
Yep.
to see how this plays out over time.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, I do agree that having, the business owner involved in that, right, where it's like now they're the one signing it off, will probably give them a little pause and force that right behavior. And ultimately, right, you're trying to, produce a cultural result, right, or a behavioral result within the company or the executives that you have by signing that off, right. And I think you and I have both seen where, right, the different product or engineering teams are, more than happy, right, to just continue on their way. And it's not that they're, I would say, maliciously doing it, right, or
No.
they're not willfully ignoring it. Is that they have jobs, right, to produce things that, not necessarily has security in the forefront of their minds, right. And that's why these processes are created to exist, to basically insert that kind of checkbox or speed bump, right, to get them to say, hey, you can do that, but your name's going to be on that thing. Like, are you okay with that? And they're like, wait, what does that mean? It's like, that means when the SEC comes a looking, they're going to be looking at you, not me, right? And they're like, oh, wait, no, we should fix that thing. It's like, yeah, that's what I thought, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and I've seen it over and over, and I think that is where what the SEC, if I were to try to interpret what they're really trying to do, is put that higher level of visibility on the potential impacts of those decisions. Because we all know with engineering, especially today, people want to move fast, get features to the world faster, deploy faster, and code flow has become much faster, just generally speaking, than it has been, in the last couple decades. So I think that the SEC statement here is really, do you have the right level of decision making and check and balances where security and compliance professionals can, speak openly and potentially even have really hard conversations on whether or not we need to do that? Because it is a balance, right? You're not going to expect some executive who has 20,000 plus employees to know every aspect of things. But if there isn't, some level of forcing function, I don't know if the right conversation will always happen organically, especially if the engineering team, has more say in the ultimate decision. But then I think the ultimate accountability should move in that direction as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think, if we think back to earlier this year, right, the SEC came out with new regulations for companies, and those are actually supposed to go into effect kind of at the end of this year. But what's interesting, right, is that those rules had some very specific requirements for companies that, you had to have an enterprise risk management a program, right, for a risk framework that you follow. You have to have cybersecurity expertise on the board, right, all of these type of things. And you have to disclose material incidents, right, within a
Mhm.
certain period of time, like 48 hours. What's interesting to me, I think probably the shock coming back to the SolarWinds, thing, is that, I agree with you that the SEC is trying to get the accountability to companies, right, to be able to say, yes, we focus on security, we're funding it properly. And really, I think that's a reaction to seeing, where companies come out and they're like, oh, we disclosed like, today that we had a security breach 4 years ago and we didn't, notify anyone, but it was about to break the news. So now we're going to notify everyone to get ahead of it. And it's like, well, that's not cool, right? I mean, like, why didn't you tell people when it happened? And I think that's what the SEC is really trying to get ahead of, is, forcing some sort of maturity. Where I struggle with is exactly as you're kind of alluding to, is, the SEC in the guidelines, those guidelines are not just for CISOs or security executives, right? They're for the entire company, right? So that means that your chief product officer or your CTO or your CFO or your CEO, right? They all are equally on the hook, right? For making sure that you're meeting those SEC regulations, doing your filings appropriately, having appropriate knowledge and representation of cybersecurity events. And so where I struggle with this is like, the history, right, from the SEC over the past year seems to have been where they're individually naming CISOs, right, in their charges, saying that,
Right.
the company was not doing stuff. And it's like, but wait a minute, SEC, you also are saying that the entire company is responsible, and the board, and like these other people. Why aren't they also being named? Or why isn't just the whole company being named? And you're not, like, why are you singling out an individual person? And I get, like, obviously, we'll disclaim this, that if you're the one that made the filing and you put your name on it, like, obviously, but as we've also talked about, that's not always the real case of what happens at that company, right? So that's where I think people are struggling with this a little bit, in terms of the precedent that it's setting, is like, you're sort of stuck, like as a CISO, for you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting because they do name the company, and I think all those other people get lumped into this corporate bucket,
Right,
right? Like the
right,
company plus this person. And, I think about the ramifications for the individual that's named, right? Because whatever the individual's named, it doesn't really matter. I mean, let's say that in a court of law, 2 years down the road, the SEC says, all right, well, you really weren't the decision maker, and drops the case. Okay, mate, let's say that happens. Well, what does that mean for that individual, though, who, probably his reputation's tarnished now to the point of,
yep,
can they even get a job someplace? So I like you say, I think it really changes the dynamic of how individuals who are signatories have to think about what it means to take on certain responsibilities, especially now that the government has been making some very clear, it's not even civil, it's criminal, saying that's fraud, right? Like, and
yeah,
it's going to be interesting to see what signatories think about when moving forward, and how do they protect themselves, and not just through like a very detailed process of identifying, exceptions, which may or may not work depending on the interpretation of the exception that was signed for, right? So
yeah.
it's going to be an interesting dynamic. So what are your thoughts about what it means for, you know, individuals managing their careers when it comes to looking at a new risk like this?
Yeah, it's tough, and I think that's where a lot of the community is looking at, like, uh-oh, like, I think we could all point back to where we have, communications that are, trying rightfully to improve the state of our security programs, get funding, whatever it is, but you're also inherently, acknowledging, right, that things are not as good as they could be. Like, I don't know how to avoid that, right? But in terms of like protecting yourself, I think, and I covered this in the blog post a little bit, I think what's going to become the norm, right, is first and foremost, regardless of whatever level of position you're in, you should ask your company, like, am I covered, right, on the either the corporate liability policy, the directors and officers policy, whatever it is, right? And this is going to vary widely depending on your company, right? But some companies, only like certain levels are on the directors and
Mm-hmm.
officers policy. Some companies, like all of the VP and above, right, are on the policy, or director and above. And so I think that's probably the first place to start, is like, hey, current company, I work here, like, I'm taking on a lot of personal risk now. Like, are you going to cover me? And so I think that's the first question. The second question, I think, is from a legal standpoint, it's like, great, you're going to cover me. what does that cover, right? So are you going to pay for my legal fees if I have to go defend myself personally? Do I get to select the legal counsel, or are you going to appoint one? Because you generally, I would, what the industry is saying is this: is you want to be able to select your own counsel that represents you, not the company, but the
Right.
company pays for it. That way, that you're trying to protect yourself. So I think there's a couple of things to do there. And look, in absence of those things, I would say, like, you might want to consider reaching out to your own insurance company and getting some sort of umbrella policy, just to say, like, look, if my job goes into the toilet and I have to defend myself legally, like, can I get some sort of umbrella coverage that would offer me legal defense, and pay for that, if I need to. And maybe that's your kind of fallback option. But going forward, I think a lot of executives are going to be looking at their current position, and if they're not covered by those things or named officers of the company, they might be like, look, this is not worth the risk. Are you guys going to fix this? And if the company says no, I think you're going to see a little bit of turnover, right, in the industry. And then what's going to happen is, as these people that turn over go and interview for new positions, they're going to start requiring, like, as part of their employment contracts, if they have one, to say, I'm a named officer of the company, I'm on the D&O policy, you're going to cover my legal costs, I get to name my lawyer, right, all of these type of things. And look, if worst case comes to worse, and let's just say that their reputation was tarnished, even though they weren't found guilty, or the company chose to part ways with him because they weren't willing to take the risk of whatever the brand reputation harm was. I think that there's going to be more emphasis on, like, some sort of severance, in addition to what normal severances are, where it's like, okay, you're going to fire me for this, or we're going to part ways. You're going to still cover my legal fees if I'm still involved in that, but you're also going to, pay me some sort of stipend while I try to get my career back on track. That's been tanked, obviously, by representing you guys. So I think there's a lot to think about here, and obviously it's going to depend on the size of your company, the industry your company's in, your relationship with the board and the other executives in the company. But I think these are all things that security executives across the board should start to think about. And I would think really, really hard about whether you want that title, right? If you see, for example, like associate director, right, of something, 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 and you're named as the CISO, but you look up when you report through like 8 different people before you get to the CEO, it's like, that might not be worth the risk, because you might have the accountability, but it might not have the authority or the responsibility. And that's where I think people are getting into some really, really sticky situations.
Yeah, I read an article it was a while back, a few years ago, that was really saying that you could tell how important that a company feels security and compliance is based on where the most senior person reports to in the company. Like
Yep.
it was almost a direct correlation of,
Yep.
depending on, that means how much influence they have to actually, check and balance at a more senior level some of the key decisions. So it'll be interesting. You mentioned an article before we started that came out recently from another CISO. Was there anything extra from that we didn't talk about yet that we'd like to bring up and discuss?
Yeah, for the audience, if you haven't seen it, CISO Online, which we can drop the link into the chat. But CISO Online on November 16th had an article that came out on this very topic. And they had an interesting perspective that I was sharing with Milan earlier, in that what they were saying is that CISOs can get into a pretty sticky situation here, right? And so what they're saying is that, let's just say your CEO or your CFO or whoever makes the filing, right? The CISO, right, should be looking at that filing, hopefully, right? Hopefully be consulted. And if they're not, that's the first thing you want to fix. But if you're consulted and you look at it and you say this thing is inaccurate, you would want to be able to fix that. And if the filing goes out and it's still inaccurate, this is where what the article is recommending is actually that the CISO now has a legal obligation to report fraud of the company. And so what they're actually recommending is that the SEC whistleblower obligations are now, the CISO needs to go out and actually file a whistleblower complaint against their company, because they knew that it was fraud in the filing, even though, like, the company still filed it. And this is where I think it's going to get, like, I mean, this is kind of a bonker situation if you think about it, right? Where it's
Yeah,
like,
it's
now you're
crazy.
an officer of the company, you have to now file a fraud thing against the company you work for. And here's where the article made a great point: is they said that if you file the whistleblower complaint and it's true, great, right? You're protected against under all of these federal laws. if you file a whistleblower complaint and it's not true and there's no fraud found, you have basically like tanked like your role and your career at that company, who then they might go and pursue you, right, for, brand and reputational harm or whatever it's going to be, right? So I think this is another area of concern that CISO Online article brings up, is like this. It's like this catch-22 situation where, what was typically the domain of like legal or CFO or whatever of these SEC kind of regulations, they're now saying that ignorance by the security executive is no longer an acceptable excuse.
Right,
If you
right.
know that fraud is happening, even though you're not the one that signs off on it, right? Coming back to your point, okay, let's say the business leader signs off on it. If you know that that is fraudulent in terms of like what you're messaging externally versus what's happening internally is different, you still have an obligation to report that externally via whatever mechanisms, for whatever country that you're in. And so I think this is challenging, right?
An
Where it's
interesting
like,
dilemma.
yeah,
Yeah.
how do you navigate that, right? So I really liked that article just because it was an interesting perspective. And there's another article that while I have time, I linked to in my blog post, where a gentleman from Bloomberg, I can't remember his name, but he makes the argument that this whole SEC charges against SolarWinds, and specifically Tim, is kind of, what he says is like kind of dubious, right? And his argument was that like how, basically what the SEC is arguing for is they're saying that investors were defrauded, or
Right.
they were given some sort of impression that the company was better than they were, and so therefore they lost like out on all these things. Okay, that may be true, right? And let's just think it back to the SolarWinds. What happened, right? There was what I would equivalent to like a nation state level attack. Now the complexity was probably really, really low from what I've read. It was like a password was really, really weak and they
Yeah.
got in, but it's still Russia was attacking them, right? They got in, they compromised the software. That software was used prevalently right across the industry, particularly in the federal government, right? And I think that was what was riling this up a little bit. But what this Bloomberg article said was that how many investors, I don't know about you, but he said, how many investors go and read those filings, those 8K, 10K, whatever, and they look and say, oh, like, thank you for the information about your cybersecurity program. I'm now going to choose invest in your company. Like, nobody does that, right? And maybe they should, right? But it's just not realistic to expect that investors are weighing, right, that level of investment in cybersecurity as their sole decision for investing in the company, right? You look at other things, P&E ratio, revenue, like all these type of things, right? And so he was saying that this was a little bit dubious because if you link back to what this is saying, and this is totally dumbing it down, but what he's effectively saying is that if you have bad or weak passwords in your environment, which I don't know any company like that, like you can't, users are going to do what they're going to do, right? And so if he basically is saying that you could be held liable for fraud if you have bad passwords because you're stating that your passwords are good, right? And I know that's a little bit of oversimplification, but I think there's some interesting perspectives about this. Is like, I'll be curious to watch it and see, like, is the SEC going to be successful in their charges? Now, this is your kind of area of expertise, from the FBI, is that like, obviously if they filed it, they probably have, what they feel like is a strong case, but it still is interesting. Like, is it really doing what they're saying they're doing?
Yeah. I do wonder how much. So I think the letter of what they probably filed individually on was almost like a federal charge of lying on a government document, right? Like
Right.
there's an actual statute for that. So like if you attest to something that's not true, like it's like lying on a government form, like that's a charge. So the interesting thing though, again, like you say, is why are they doing this? Is it really to raise visibility of the risk to the appropriate level by having, more senior people keep more overwatch? And like you say, it's a very slippery slope here because, do you really? So one thing that I know we talked about is, okay, let's play this out. Let's play this out that really good security professionals are going to want some serious protections before they're going to go take on this role, especially if the company they don't know, all the things that you mentioned, right? Well,
Yeah.
what happens then if the company doesn't want to pay for that, right? Assuredness. Will they likely get less qualified people who are willing to take on that risk potential? I actually see it could cause even more security and compliance risk because
I agree.
people that are really, really good are going to want really, really good protections, and not every company can afford it. Like if you're a medium small company that's doing government contracts, but you want a really good CISO that's going to require you to pay for all these extra things.
Right. Right.
They may not
No,
even
no,
pay, which means they're going to go with a cheaper bidder, lowest bidder, and then which may not be somebody who is as trained and professional to understand what they're really doing. So I think it could actually almost work against some companies in some way of getting really good professionals, because they may not have the funds to go put in all these extra protections for a CISO if it goes down that path.
I agree with you. And you and I talked about this, I think it was a week or two ago, but let me just step back a little bit. And I think this is an inherent problem across the industry, where the use, right, of the CISO title is, there's not really a lot of standardization in it, right? And what I mean by that is, like, I looked on LinkedIn, right, and I'm constantly just, oh, who's hiring, right? And you look out there, and they range all the way from, like I said, associate directors, which, okay, if it's a startup, maybe that's great, all the way up to senior vice president, executive vice president, actual named CISOs, right? And so you have a very wide range, right, of the actual position. And then let's confuse this even more. Now you have like field CISOs, right? And you have like consulting CISOs, and you have like retained CISOs, and you have like all of these different like CISO titles out there, where it's like, to your point, like the company is going to find someone, right? It's like, if they want to hire like a really good professional with a lot of years of experience and all the certifications and things like that in the industry, they might not be able to afford that, because the cost of security, in my opinion, based on the ripple effects of this SEC regulation, is going to go up, right? Now you have to look at, they have to carry an insurance policy. They have to, account for severance. They have to account for all of these things that, might happen or might not happen, but those all have to get disclosed as part of compensation, et cetera. What would have been, this X, level of salary is now 2X, 3X, 4X, 5X, just to kind of carry that person for that position. And if the company can't afford that, to your point, well, they'll find the next up and coming person, right, that'll want to do that, right, but isn't willing to take the risk. And now I think we're going to get into some really, 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 really interesting situations,
Yeah, another interesting area for me is, a lot of the CISOs now might require, in their contract to have more say in what actually happens from a release perspective, right? Yeah. Like, what does it mean? Like, if CISO doesn't agree that anybody should accept that risk if they're signing, are they going to ask for more direct approval for things that may go out, where before it was pretty much the engineering decision making? Are they going to accept that, where they have to sign the paperwork and they come to a position where they can't, because they just say, hey, we don't agree on this, so how are we going to resolve it? I think it'll drive a lot of the good conversations, but then it goes back to the how are they organized as peers, where they can have a peer conversation? They both have to come to an agreement on what the acceptable risk is, or does one or the other get to make the ultimate decision, and then we have to have all those other protections put in place, right? Where it's very clear. Because again, when I go back to how fraud cases work, it starts with the paperwork and who signs what and who does it get filed with. Like, that's where it all starts. And you can have all these other, after the fact conversations trying to defend certain positions, right? Hey, I notified them, but you still signed the paperwork. Like you can't really resolve that legally. At least I couldn't criminally. I've helped prosecute dozens of these cases. So it really does go back to what is the expectation of the signatory? And I think that's what, the way I read it, the SEC is trying to elevate, which was that, in their opinion, right, fraud was perpetrated by the person who was supposed to protecting by allowing paperwork, even whether they signed it directly or they allowed it to be signed, where they should have, notified somebody about what this issue was. But it's going to be interesting to see how the court case actually plays out when they actually take it to court, because I think that's when we're going to see, do they truly believe that fraud happened and there was a real criminal charge here, or are they just trying to make a statement saying, hey, you all are on notice, you better up your game in this space? So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the court case.
Yeah, I definitely think that this will have a positive effect on the industry. It's just, to your point, like, you can raise the bar for something, but like, it typically costs money, right? So to do that, and then, I do think as well, right, that this may prompt some interesting discussions, right, around, the CISO role, where, maybe there's some standardization for use of the title, maybe not, that's fine. But, you made a great point, I think it was last week, where it's like, okay, maybe the company wants to hire you, right? But you're not comfortable with what's going on. So maybe you're going to have the accountability, but you don't have the authority, right? Or you don't have the responsibility, whatever it is, right? And so that's not a great situation to be in. And so, right, where you're looking at that personal risk, you might say, okay, well, I'll be a consultant, right? I'll come on and
Right.
be a highly paid consultant for you. And now you don't have to worry about any of these, liability insurance, right? Or naming me on the D&O policy or, having severance, right? But you're going to pay me, an arm and a leg to come in here and advise you to get your security program where it needs to be and make accurate statements and all these type of things. And then maybe when you're in a mature enough state and we agree, then I will agree to come on as that thing, right? But I do think that there's a lot of, to your point, healthy discussion and dialogue that's going to happen going forward for what is this role? Is it truly supported? Does it have the authority and responsibility supported, right, by the rest of the
Right.
business? Because just having the accountability, which we're seeing here, I think is putting a lot of people on edge for whether or not they really want to continue in that role or take that new role, for example.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's going to be a real interesting dynamic to see how it kind of plays out as we get a little further along and we really see how the industry is going to respond to this generally. Because I don't think other than these few articles we've seen, until the court case actually comes out, we see our
Yeah.
charges being actually pursued. Like, is there a financial penalty put on the individual and the company for this? Like, it's going to be
Right.
it's going to set a new bar, I think, for what the expectation is. And again, as we've talked about, ignorance is not an excuse. So
Yeah.
does that mean you have to even have, this is going to result in friction, right? In engineering friction, because all of this is time and money, anything more you
Yeah.
do. So what's the right balance of that? It's going to be it's going to be really neat to see. Well, not neat to see, but it's going to be interesting to see, to use that word over again, how it really plays out. And I don't think all of us really understand what the long-term ramifications are. So yeah, anything else, Lee, on this topic we want to chat about? It's a
I've
great
got
topic to
some
talk
some
through.
controversial closing comments for you. These are my own thoughts, but I've been
Okay,
kind of like thinking
let's go
about
there.
this. So I suspect, right, and I don't have any evidence for this or not, but if you think back to SolarWinds, right, at the time of the right, whatever you want to call it, the attack or the compromise, right, of their software, they were very, very prevalent within the federal government, right, the U.S. federal government. And I suspect this is a little bit of, I won't necessarily call it retaliation, but a little bit of like, hey, we're going to come after you because, we thought that your product was good. And, we ended up getting compromised through you, and your handling of that or whatever it wasn't sufficient to give us, the comfort in this going forward. And there may be a little bit of like that sort of flavor woven into it. I don't know for certain, but I suspect that there's a little bit of people within the government being like, what the hell happened here? So that's my first controversial statement. And then my second one is what I think, after we watch this case going forward, and certainly as the evidence comes out, but if you think back to like what it means to be a named CISO, right, actually carry that CISO title, what might be interesting, or maybe, this is where the SEC is going, and I don't know about if this is true or not, but look, I mean, the SEC already investigates like insider trading, for example, right? And if you're found guilty of insider trading, right, you might do jail time, but you're typically also banned, right, from
Right.
participating in financial markets, right? So are we going to see at some point, coming back to your kind of career reputational, like, personal brand type thing, where if you are a named CISO, right, and the SEC files charges against you, would they, for example, bar you from being a named CISO going forward? I mean, it's a possible outcome. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I mean, how do you enforce that? But I do think it's an interesting avenue that they could take, where it's like, if you could kind of dial in what it means to be a CISO and what the level is and have consistency across the industry, they could start banning people from doing that, and that would be obviously a difficult position to be in as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, I think there's lots of really interesting ways that we look at the problem, but also what the outcome is going to end up being as we get through the court case and as more and more articles are getting written. Because I can tell you that these cases take a while, like for the
Yeah.
government. I mean, they
Yeah.
have to subpoena all the records. They probably had tens of thousands of documents and emails to go through. Because somebody else asked me, he's like, why is it, why are they doing it now? I said, well, it probably took them this long just to dig through all the paperwork, right? Like,
Right.
and as
Right.
you say, this impacted government systems. So clearly somebody's going to take a hard look at anything that the government uses, they're going to take a hard look at to see,
Right.
was the right thing done. Kind of like with FedRAMP, there's a whole lot of process involved in order to ensure that there's a certain level of acceptance when it comes to that kind of product, in government, production. So again, Lee, I say, great conversation, and I think maybe we'll have to revisit this when we get more information from the external parties about how this is going. I think we'll come back and kind of take the next look at it when maybe we get more information about what the SEC's moving forward with in terms of the criminal case.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Lee, and thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.
Yeah, see ya.